My name is Joshua Gibson, and you are listening to the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast, a show dedicated to promoting a message of critical thinking as it pertains to strength training, nutrition, and well-being. This is done through interviews with experts, high-level athletes, coaches, and people heavily involved in strength sports and athletic development. Pull up a chair, grab a coffee, and let's get on to today's podcast.
Yeah, I think this is the question, right? Like, this is ultimately the application question. You have all this cool stuff in books and papers that you read, but how do you actually sit down and apply it to an individual? And this will flow nicely into kind of the reason I wanted to investigate this for my PhD. But ultimately, I think this is where, I'm obviously biased as an academic, but this is where I just think research is extremely helpful, because you quite literally have to have a starting point in a system of prioritization. And I'm a big believer that there's 100 different ways you could go about coaching, attacking a problem, etc. But having a system, kind of regardless of what that is, or a systematic way at which you approach prescription for a given individual, I think allows you to identify potential patterns more readily. So that's something I'm a pretty big believer in that I don't care what your system is. I don't care how you go about it. There's a ton of different approaches that are valid. But if you get a specific way to look at an athlete, their past training history, their needs, things like that, and you get more reps at looking at the problem in that way, I think you're more likely to identify blind spots in your system and ways to counteract that, and also develop patterns that may have an increased probability of you arriving on the best, or in a relative sense, the best conclusion for that individual. So that's a big part of the way that I view it. Is, research is going to give us the highest probable estimations of things that are going to generalize to the population. Obviously, there's a bit of selection bias for people that come to coaching, and particularly the niche which then you get clients. That's all going to have some selection bias in terms of the people that you're going to have working with. And then allowing that system to be something that you ultimately get reps with, I think is going to both increase the probability of you landing on a good decision. Now, from like a actual practical perspective, I think this is just where the way I kind of talked about the proximity to failure meta-analysis is kind of the way that I view a lot of things. Is I want to understand on a broad scale, what is the directionality in which these training variables operate with the training adaptation of interest. And that allows me to, on a sliding scale and interacting with the multiple different factors, kind of make determinations on how those things should look at a given point in time. And so that's really what I rely on a basic level, as I kind of, go through my little checklist of training variables and how those interrelate with one another, to the ones that I believe are the kind of the highest priority for a given phase or just in general. And then I make my best guess with the research in mind, and then how this individual may diverge based on, the interrelationship between my experience and the clients that I have dealt with in the past, and then obviously my own training experience as well. And then that's ultimately going to lead me interfacing my beliefs onto the actual training program. So that's kind of from a high level, kind of how I think about things. And then from there, that's the $1 million question to me. Is it's not about the first program, but it's about your systematic process of adjusting the program when the desired result isn't achieved. And that's where you make your money as a coach, in my opinion. It's not that first program. It's the ability to create a systematic procedures to arrive on a better destination upon a plateau.
Hey, what's up, weightlifters? Danny here, founder of Onyx Weightlifting Co., a leather accessories company specializing in weightlifting gear. In our shop, we make gear that doesn't get in the way of your performance, because we understand that hitting lifts requires your full attention. Our straps, wrist wraps, and belts are designed to be comfortable and reliable, so all you need to do is make lifts. Thanks for listening to our friend Josh's podcast. You can continue to support him by visiting our online shop at onyxstraps.com and using his code PHILWL. That's PHILWL at checkout. See you on the platform.
So I'll ask you more of a selfish question on my end.
Sure.
I have people that I've worked with, for years, and you find something that ends up working, and you're like, okay, I'll do a close approximation to this, and then it works, and do a close approximation and it works. To me, that can feel I don't want to say it feels lazy, but it feels like less work, and maybe rightfully so, because I
Yeah.
don't know how much you need to reinvent the process to get an even bigger reward. It's like saying, well, this lottery ticket won a lot of money, but I'd like to win even more money the next time.
Yep.
Versus, oh, here's a continual stream because I've somewhat figured out a system or process of buying pull tabs or scratch offs or whatever your
Sure.
hobby is at the gas station. Um, so from your perspective, what is that process like? How much do you think, when you find something that works, things need to further differentiate? Or if you've experienced something similar, like what are your thoughts on thinking about what the more discrete iterative process is like?
So I think this kind of goes in a couple different directions in terms of the way that my beliefs have shifted a little bit over time, kind of regarding this issue, and then just kind of regarding individual adjustments over time. Is the biggest predictor of someone, making a given amount of progress is just going to be like who that individual is, their genetic makeup, et cetera. Like that's going to be the like from an absolute progress perspective, that's going to be the biggest predictor. There is just, kind of things outside of our control. And manipulations, particularly small ones to the training intervention, while they may have some influence, I don't think it's going to be like this huge night and day thing, which we can kind of talk about a little bit more, because there's a lot of nuance that goes into that. But just as a broad level, I don't think like micro adjustments to the program are going to absolutely massively change the expected outcome, for example, in most cases. So with that kind of in mind, I think it takes a little bit of pressure off of both from a humility perspective, the degree to which we can influence things, but also from a pressure perspective, the degree to which we can influence things. Right. So I think that's the $1 million thing, is you're basically trying to keep the athlete engaged so that the same effort, consistency, those kind of things that ultimately are going to be some of the biggest predictors of the efficacy of a training intervention are still in place. And so then understanding the hierarchy of things that are going to have the highest probability of influencing the output of the training intervention, we can take some of those lower tier items to potentially mix things up, keep the athlete engaged, and ultimately keep applying a high effort input into that training program so that the output is still something that that we desire. I probably used to be of the mindset that, like, let's say we got a 5-kilo increase on this training block. Let's try to get that 7.5-kilo increase in the next block. Let's manipulate some things like that. I think I've become much more okay with, hey, a positive outcome is awesome. If we can over time naturally get to an even more positive outcome, great. But I'm not going to completely abandon ship of something that's working, to kind of really try to even up that even more. I think the grass is almost never greener, particularly when the direction of trying to get more progress is usually a more aggressive training intervention that could have a kind of coming off the cliff on the backside of it, where in the long term, injuries, setbacks, things like that, burnout, all of those things are going to have a negative implication in the long term, where stacking up those small wins may actually lead us to a greater destination in the long term. So as long as you're getting some money back on those scratch off tickets, I wouldn't be playing around with buying different kinds all too much. That would be kind of the way that I would think about it for the most part. But yeah, I think my perspective has changed a little bit on how micro adjustments kind of can positively or negatively influence things all too much, so that it much more becomes a decision on how to keep this particular athlete engaged and applying high effort to a given training intervention over time, which is probably going to be the biggest contributor there, along with their genetics.
Yeah, and of course, when I have smart people on, I like to ask a lot of personal questions, like, "What do you think about my outfit?" No, training related personal questions. So it tends to derail the conversation a bit, but this will be my last one, I promise. Before we get into your current work, and it would be volume changes across time, specifically within a training block. I've always been slightly disillusioned with the idea that a 10% change in the way I measure volume, or the way I track volume, just a heuristic, is with total reps in particular exercises. And this isn't novel, it's not new, it's not sexy. It's just something that gives me a visual on what's happening. And then you kind of track, maybe you track what would be called tonnage here, what could be called work. It's just like total amount of weight lifted by sets times reps times load. And then that, per exercise and across time. And then you're just looking at the changes in numbers and you're saying, okay, when we do this much stuff, which is actually complicated quite a bit by the differences in exercise selection, which make those things more tolerable or less tolerable,
Yep.
or more predictable or less predictable. Examples would be if you do something that's half the you could say half the displacement, which would be, you do, imagine you do a third squat instead of like an ass to grass, literally kissing the ground with your butt cheek squat. That's going to apply stress a little bit differently, especially if you have, a certain amount of work. And then also, you could play around with other factors because all exercises are like that. You have a technical component. So if you do something that the person is less technically skilled at or struggles to do consistently over time, or they aren't able to repeat the same effort over time. So every rep looks kind of different or kind of weird or kind of wonky, which is more relevant in weightlifting, where their balance is all over the place, their bar placement's all over the place. That could really complicate, the way the work is almost like digested and dealt with. So I think about these small fluctuations, again, in whatever way you measure them, in volume as probably not that meaningful unless you're seeing like subjective change. You would be looking at like performance changes, or perceived changes in performance. So they would say, wow, I feel really great. This like quote unquote unload or deload week has helped a lot. It's like, okay, so we've decreased training stress sufficiently to potentially have them feel better, assuming it's just like a natural fluctuation, or I say natural, but like a fluctuation that would have happened. Obviously there are a lot of like caveats here, but, and then you would also have, changes that you think would be meaningful, but you don't see a perceived difference or you don't see a performance difference. And from a coaching standpoint, you would say, well, you just don't look fresh. You don't look sharp. You don't look fast. You don't look technical. So it looks like you were quote unquote fatigued. When I mess around with volumes, after speaking to Dr. Kyle Travis, who's done a lot of work on overreaching and tapering, and peaking, and he talks about it. He talks about, not needing a ton of time to express, peak performance after an overreach, or, tapers don't typically wouldn't need to be dramatic or extended or extreme, in terms of the amount of time they take across time, and that you could, in some cases get away with an extra day or two off. And from anecdotal experience or personal experience, I've competed a handful of times where I've just taken 3 days off, and had normal training up to that point, 4 days off. And some, it's mostly life circumstances. It was an unplanned competition. And then there are also like performance factors of, I tend to really enjoy competition. I tend to always perform well or above and beyond what's expected or match what's expected. But I've noticed that, just taking a few extra days off, I feel great. I feel incredible. And I tend to perform well. So it just has me thinking about the way volume is managed across time. Specifically when there's like a baseline of work done that's tolerable. So I have people I program for, I'll give them a certain amount of quote unquote reps, and it's like tracks with a certain amount of quote unquote tonnage. And I would say like, oh, you can do this and you don't feel beat up, you don't feel tired, you don't feel fatigued, performance is relatively stable. Okay, let's see if we can add work or we can change the quality of the work, change the distribution in terms of intensities or load, and kind of track what happens. For you, when you talked about the differences between programs and some of those discrete factors not really playing much of a role or potentially playing much of a role in influencing the outcome or different outcomes, how do you look at changes in volume across time? And you can talk about in terms of importance, in terms of practicality, and then in terms of eliciting the response that you wanted. to elicit, and maybe more broadly how you conceptualize it. So what are your thoughts on volume changes across time for, say, powerlifting performance at a competition?
Sure. So it's a tough question to answer. I think ultimately the way that I view this problem is I'll kind of take you through my thought process when I think about this kind of stuff. So the first question I would ask myself is, broadly speaking, what do we believe the directionality or the dose response relationship with strength and volume? And typically, in my experience, and I would say what the research is going to show for the most part, is that it's a positive response, meaning more volume is going to lead to more strength, but it's definitely going to taper off relatively quickly. And the tough thing with strength is obviously it's a multifactorial adaptation, right? There's a lot of things that can influence strength. So when you're thinking about volume for strength, there's volume for strength in the immediate, or like that short to moderate term, where I'm kind of thinking about, okay, I want to express strength phase. And then you have volume for strength where I'm in that quote unquote strength development phase, where I'm not necessarily immediately concerned about my ability to express said strength. And I'm making the assumption that if I accumulate certain adaptations and maintain those throughout the kind of the next quote unquote expression phase, I'll be able to potentiate my performance in some way. So that's the first caveat. So understanding that the way that volume looks for, again, I'll just come back to hypertrophy. Hypertrophy is going to have a much more positive relationship with volume than strength. So in that case, just purely based on that logic, you could make an argument for having higher volumes in a hypertrophy-oriented strength development phase versus a strength expression phase, and that's going to kind of decrease that that volume curve over time purely based on that. But if we're talking about kind of within let's say we're taking more of a concurrent approach and we're kind of trying to decide the dosage that an individual is going to, kind of do the best with, I think that's where kind of leaning on the directionality of these relationships is kind of the way that I think about it, is that, okay, for the most part, if the training is organized in a way that's kind of directed towards the adaptations that we want. So for strength, we're not going to be doing a ton of sets at 30% of 1RM, for example. The dosage of that training is probably going to be related to the outcomes that we see. But the thing we have to balance there is the environmental context in which this individual, their genetics, everything exists. So it's probably not the case that the dose response relationship for this individual's physiology is completely different than all other humans, but it could be the case that their environment does not allow them to reach the same absolute level of dosage than someone else. And that's kind of the way that I view individualization at this point in time. And so that's a combination of their genetics. It's a combination of their instantaneous environmental factors, which obviously fluctuate over time. And you're trying to match that with the kind of objective performance that you're seeing. And so for strength, the nice thing there is that it's relatively easy because we're actually measuring the outcome that we care about. So we can be relatively outcome oriented in our decision making. So if we're not seeing a positive outcome there, then you check the environmental context, their ability to recover, and so long as that doesn't have any major red flags, I would operate in kind of the directionality of the dose response relationship. And so the thing I probably shifted to over time is as I've gained more insight on kind of how some of this individualization research works, is that I tend to rely on the group level stuff and kind of understanding that dose response relationship a little bit more in terms of the directionality of troubleshooting, and then thinking about the environmental context even more. Like I think it's easy for coaches to say like sleep matters, nutrition matters, stress matters, but I think that stuff matters a lot. And I think that is something that is almost an afterthought in a lot of the way that people think about training, where I think that's almost a primary factor up there with genetics, because that is going to be permissive to the place that you can place yourself on that dose response curve that likely is going to operate kind of on that physiology independent level. Like I don't think, for the most part, I don't think humans, respond super uniquely to like a mechanical stimulus, right? Like hypertrophy doesn't occur for completely different mechanisms for you than it does for me. Probably. I don't know that for a fact, but that's my hunch. Like most things in biology are kind of, similar mechanisms. So that's kind of the way that I think about it now is, okay, from a troubleshooting perspective, let's try to get this individual to tolerate as much dose as possible and the formulation of training that we think is going to optimize the adaptation. But the quote unquote individual differences and the individual prescriptions are going to be contextualized based on the environmental factors that we can't really control a ton. And so that's what can result for a given individual, not only between people, but also over time, receiving a different training prescription and seeing outcomes for it because of those environmental factors and their ability to tolerate things and individual injuries and things like that is kind of the way that I think about the troubleshooting process for pretty much all training variables now. And training volume is just one example of that. So it comes from, better approximating and understanding the dose response relationship of the primary training variables, being able to better proxy and account for the changes in the environment that I think are really, really important and probably are undersold how important they are. Asking a sleep question and things like that is probably not sufficient to scale with how much effort we put into tracking volume and tracking intensity and tracking estimated 1RM and all these kind of stuff. Like I think a lot of work could be put into the environmental stuff that would allow us to tolerate and benefit from more training, or not necessarily more training, but the training that we would believe would maximize an adaptation. So I don't even know if that answers the question, but that's that's kind of just my general ramble on how individual prescription works, troubleshooting, things like that works over time. Is ultimately just trying to intersect the way that these training variables not only operate in isolation but also interacting with one another, and then interfacing that with the environmental factors that occur on the individual level with their genetics, sleep, stress, nutrition, injury history, etc. Which can result in a different presentation of the training intervention that can optimize progression, which is definitely going to have a decently wide range, in my opinion, of what can work pretty well.
Yeah, I think it's easy to fall, personally speaking, it's easy to fall into a trap of almost like fallacious thinking where it's my nutrition's good. Or my nutrition's good. I probably consume enough calories or enough to gain weight. It's like a relatively well-rounded diet. I sleep as much as I can. I don't minimize stress well or tolerate external stress well, but it exists.
Yeah.
And therefore people are likely the same in that their nutrition is probably well taken care of and they're probably sleeping as much as they can, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you say, well, I check the box for myself, therefore other people will also be checking those boxes.
Yep.
When in reality, there's going to be a lot of variability in those things. Someone might come up to you and say, an athlete or someone you're coaching, oh, well, I had a Taco Bell taco today and that was it. And it's like,
Yep.
well, it's 11 p.m.,
Yep.
and you're like, okay, so that does have a huge role in influencing how the training is processed and what it actually ends up doing, or how much of it we can end up doing. So I think those are well taken points. And I think it's something you get used to, but you don't get used to, of how do we circle back to the big things that tend to matter that we can influence.
Yep.
Assuming we're just like not grossly off or grossly wrong.
Yep.
We're not just doing a one set to failure on machines to improve squat, bench, and deadlift 1RM.
Right.
But we have a rough approximation. And, to the other point, I think dialing in those generally most effective aspects of training of, are we doing enough training? Are we doing a sufficient amount? And a great example of this is I used to write programs and I really didn't track anything. And I didn't track anything, as in the sense of I didn't have an idea of like, what could I track for volume that it could at least be somewhat correlated to changes. And I'd get, whatever results, and they weren't bad. And then I kind of a bit later started working with the same person and did try to track things a little more closely. And, lo and behold, they got better results.
Yep.
Or at least equatable results, but in a shorter time span.
Sorry to interrupt you, but the other thing I think is important about the volume discussion in particular is that an often given narrative on this is that as individuals get more advanced, they actually need less volume, or volume needs don't go up, things like that. I think the tough thing there from like a causal perspective to untie is that as you train longer, you learn how to train more efficiently and more effective. And so I think if you took like an avatar that was able to train with perfect quality from day one, which is never the case in reality, I don't actually think that the volume needs would go down. At least I wouldn't suspect so. I think it would kind of look a lot more like you'd kind of expect in the sense that to reach a given level of success or adaptation or whatever, it would need kind of a progressively higher dose over time. But the reason that's not actually the case is because you're able to deliver from like a practical training perspective, sets, reps, etc., just a more efficient directed stimulus on whatever the adaptation you care about is later down the line, because you're able to use exercise selection that better targets this individual's based on their biomechanics limiter for the squat. For example, I'm not doing a hyper specific DUP program that is predominantly for this individual going to focus on their hip extenders when the thing that's limiting their 1RM is not their hip extenders. So you're doing 20 sets of squat a week, when in reality you could have got the same result or even a more efficient result by doing 10 sets a week and performing tons of your volume directed towards your actual muscular limiter for the movement that you care about. So it's those kind of things that I think make the volume relationship a bit less intuitive. Obviously you have other things like just training quality, tempo, accuracy, proximity to failure, intent, focus, just all the basic things of just overall training skill, training quality are going to improve over time as you get more serious with things and just train for longer. And those are going to be kind of limiting our ability to understand volume needs over time, because those are always going to be kind of coinciding relationships that are kind of difficult to untie. So I think for the most part, I would think that the dosage kind of thing kind of makes sense. And we're basically trying to find the dosage that is permissive given the environmental factors and the genetic individual differences for the individual, and kind of titrate those things over time based on progression and then the changes in those environmental factors to kind of get the desired thing that we want, which it sounds simple. Obviously, it's a lot more complex than that when you actually put it in on the day to day. But that seems to make sense to me, kind of in comparison to most things in kind of biology. If you kind of take a step back.
No, I think those are great points. And I think the reason I like conversations like this is sometimes it's nice to be reminded that training can be both the most straightforward thing and also the most. Not the most, I mean this kind of like generally, but like very, very complex too.
Yep.
And it just depends on the level of analysis. And I think that holds with, I think that holds with everything you do. And I mean that literally in the sense of, their philosophy is largely a field of inquiry where we're thinking about, okay, why is this the way it is? A question I've encountered probably far too often for a normal white male in his 30s in West Virginia is like, what is free will? Do we have it? And how do we think about it? And then, okay, is thinking about it, is that a part of not having it? So they're like these philosophical questions that at the heart can be super, super, super simple of, well, does it really matter? Just, operate like a automaton and who cares? And on the other end, here's this deep philosophical matter that you can peel back every layer on and get like evolutionary biology. You can get the underlying physiology or neurophysiology or whatever name you want to give to it, of talking about the interaction of physical stuff. And that's like, where do your interests intersect that? And I think with training, that's kind of what it feels like now. Is it can be both simple and straightforward of, focus on these things, or try to best dial in these things and iterate, which all coaches can do. And a lot of coaches have done well, probably not knowing a ton of theory or like the intricacies of the stuff underpinning what's happening and expressing itself. or you can take it as far as getting a PhD in studying individual differences in training response, which is what you're doing. So to set the scene a bit, what's the question you're attempting to answer, Zach, and how are you attempting to answer it? And has it been a straightforward process?
Well, the latter is definitely no. So, as we've already talked about a good amount here, is just my interest in research has always been strong, and the more that I got to hear, rebuttals to why certain data apply, why it doesn't, how it can be used to inform actual practice. Basically the common thing you're always going to hear. Talking about group level data, averages, means, things like that, is just like, be aware of variability or be aware of individual differences, et cetera, et cetera. And always pointing out, the spread of different individual data points, et cetera, which is obviously, it's a good practice. And it's obviously the next implication there is like, okay, from like a practical perspective, if the group level data say this, but the individual data can say otherwise, how do I actually put this into practice if the two are at odds with one another? And so my interest then became to like, okay, let's actually give people tools to try to identify these things on the front end and be able to prescribe better training interventions for the individual based on the level of variability that we see and any sort of predictors that we could use from a baseline perspective. So that's broadly speaking what my dissertation is trying to do, or explore at least. But throughout the process, I've been pushed by my committee to understand this in the methodology associated with it better than I did initially, and it's just a really messy topic to research appropriately and appropriately contextualize with all the different sources of variation and error that one would need to account for to draw the perfect causal arrow between training intervention and variability and outcome for the individual. So there's lots of research that shows a lot of gross what I'd call outcome variability to a given resistance training intervention. But in terms of studies that really try to answer, does this individual respond uniquely to two different training interventions, is pretty few and far between, mostly just because it requires quite a laborious study design to actually answer that. So I've been fortunate enough and got a lot of help from the team at the Muscle Lab here to try to carry out one of these interventions, and that has been a definite learning experience to know how much work goes into trying to research these things rigorously, and learned a ton along the way. And one of the members of my committee has done one of the probably the best project on this topic that I for whatever reason on social media has not taken off, and I think it's underappreciated, is basically going through all of the research comparing resistance training interventions to control conditions that don't train, and looking at the variation in the outcomes associated with that. And basically, if individual response variation to resistance training was truly expected, you would think that the addition of a resistance training intervention would increase the amount of variability associated with the outcome in comparison to a control condition. And we actually see basically the opposite, which is ultimately questioning the idea that, is there actually this individual gross response variability to, the resistance training stimulus, or do people respond relatively uniformly? And the thing that separates them is just the absolute amount of an outcome that they see based on their genetic and environmental factors, like we've kind of discussed here. And there's limitations to that analysis. I'm not going to write off, I'm a coach as well. I've observed, things that seem to result in, very strong individual differences in terms of outcome based on a change we made to training. But obviously on, individual level observations are inherently limited. This is why we do research in the first place, et cetera. But that analysis is on untrained individuals, comparing, a single resistance training intervention to a control, not comparing multiple resistance training interventions, et cetera. But it's got a ton of data in it, and it's probably one of the most powered things in kind of the resistance training literature. So it's an interesting kind of topic. And so I'm trying to apply some of that kind of methodological understanding to a study in trained individuals, comparing multiple resistance training interventions to kind of try to take the next step and kind of research this in a rigorous manner, and trying to account for the limitations as best we can. But it's definitely not been a straightforward process. Learned a lot, realized I was wrong about a lot of things, and still doing so. So I'm hoping to find some interesting results. But the data are what the data are, so we'll see what we find.
Yeah, and I think there are two ways I'd like to tackle this. The first is going to be from a broad, more process-oriented perspective for people who are interested in academia, interested in pursuing higher level education, either as a master's student or a PhD student, or EDD, whatever, a professional degree, I don't know, but like a higher level education. What was the process like of coming up with the topic? And then how did you kind of stumble upon, this is the thing I want to know more about, given you could literally try to ask questions about an uncountable number of things, right?
Sure.
So how did you come to the conclusion that this was the thing you wanted to put so much time into and effort into, and kind of plant your flag on as a doc student?
I think the thing that interested me the most about it was kind of two things. One, it kind of was cross transferable to basically all of resistance training research, which is something I'm interested in, like not hunkering myself down in one area very specifically. Studying individual differences. I'm doing that with like a specific, like I'm studying training volume in particular for my study, because that's the most well documented variable with like gross outcome variability. But it is cross transferable to basically all of resistance training research. And that was something I was interested in, just kind of better improving my skill set to do, good research broadly and understand that better. But then fundamentally, it's just that's what people want to know from a practical perspective, and I found it the most directly applicable. Like, how am I going to convince or give methods to a very advanced coach to improve their ability to work with athletes, and ultimately improve their coaching efficacy, and throwing them a meta-analysis on proximity to failure even isn't going to probably change their practice a whole lot. So I was thinking about things that I could do that were going to be particularly impactful, and I think understanding this and potentially some ecologically valid tools that could help initial prescriptions if things play out could be really useful. And I think that is kind of where it stemmed, is just from my coaching perspective, like what things could I do to improve my success rate initially with a client, to hopefully get them down the line to a higher peak is ultimately the idea there. So it really came from a personal interest perspective, and just my experience about, okay, how can I improve my success rate? What things would actually be useful for coaches broadly to utilize? And then as kind of a secondary benefit, just from my interest in science and research and things like that, it's just a broadly applicable topic that I can apply to not only resistance training, but other areas of interest as well. Just improve my skill set that way, and ultimately challenged me to grow and improve my my skill sets as a scientist the best I could with this topic, and my committee really pushing me to do that. So it's been a good. I'm glad I chose the topic for sure. I've realized how wrong I was about a lot of things, and it's caused a lot of headache in a good way. But I want to change it for sure.
Do you have any? And for people listening who are like, "Oh, that's really really cool," I wonder how I can find a similar idea or similar line of thinking that interests me for whatever level of work or content creation and generation. Did you have any other topics that you played around with and you kind of singled in on this one, or was it kind of the first come, first serve type situation where it's like, oh, this thing makes sense, and then it kind of like checks all the boxes as we go, and it tended to be the thing that just stuck around through the entire process?
I'd say it's mostly the latter. I was pretty interested in this kind of throughout. It's just as I was kind of performing the proximity to failure stuff initially, I just realized, how much like variability I was seeing in the responses for some of the participants in the lab, and reading the studies, like the spread of data, and just like kind of theorizing things that would maybe result in someone benefiting from one thing versus the other and things like that. And I don't think necessarily all those ideas were supported now that I know a little bit more about it, but that was kind of what got me thinking about it initially. In terms of like other things that I'm interested in, there's quite a lot that I kind of have like small tabs on in terms of things that kind of pique my interest. The relationship between muscle size and muscle strength is something that's interesting, and is another really tough philosophical kind of question to tackle from a research perspective. Basically, you can't randomly assign hypertrophy, so there's always issues that are like not controlled in the training intervention, and some of the conversation on that topic and research that goes into it, I think is really, really interesting. And also challenges from an epistemic perspective, how do we form our beliefs that we take into practice? Because I would put on the table that I personally definitely coach with the idea that muscle size potentiates strength gain and is kind of the biggest predictor long term. But from the direct experimental evidence, it's not a particularly compelling case. And so like that, those types of things I think are really interesting, a little bit more broad scale epistemic questions that challenge the way that you think about things and can ultimately improve your critical thinking and principled thinking are kind of the things that I gravitate towards personally. But other people really like the super ecologically valid questions and thinking and those kind of things often do really, really well to improve practice as well. Like I just think of a basic example is, there's a study a while ago that did a really, really good job in investigating some of the long muscle length stuff that has kind of come out. It's a study by Mayo and colleagues where they compared a lying leg curl versus a seated leg curl. And they kind of did, they looked at the muscle size of a bunch of different muscles that kind of allowed for this hypothesis to be really robustly tested in terms of training a muscle at a longer length. And so like, that's like a different area where you're taking a pretty basic thing at face value, like literally just comparing two different exercises, but the way in which you're investigating the question with the rigor that they did allowed for a very, very robust kind of understanding to come from it. So there's kind of two different ways you can go about achieving a project that or topic that you're really interested in investigating. And it can come from a lot of different ways, just depending on what you're interested in. But just always trying to basically just the thing that I'm passionate about is just trying to improve my ability to answer questions and the validity of which I do so. So that's the main drive for me. And this topic has, kind of piqued my interest to start there, but there's definitely some other things I think are kind of other candidates in which people could do that. So this isn't by any means the only topic you can do that with.
Yeah, and before you're able to analyze the data and write it up and publish it, is there work you would direct our listeners to that has provided a lot of the framework for what you're doing, or a lot of the work that you included in your lit review that people could check out? And I think you earlier in the podcast you said it's preprint, like currently in preprint. I don't know where you're at with the lit review, but is there other information we can provide to provide context before this work specifically is published?
Yeah, so I did a basically what I try to do is I try to provide a practitioner's language. Obviously have to be like academically interested in. There's a little bit of statistical jargon in there and stuff that's a little bit less friendly, but I try to provide some relatively straightforward language on the limitations that exist in the current research and the study designs that are necessary to kind of look at the individual response in resistance training research. And so the preprint that I mentioned there, we've submitted that to publication. So that's basically the full version minus the adjustments from peer review process that is publicly available on the website Sport Archive. So just Sport RXIV. You find it in there. If you just type in individual response, I'm sure it'll come up. But aside from that, in terms of the kind of the biggest inspiration for me reading and kind of drafting some of the things would be first and foremost the meta-analysis that I mentioned by Dr. James Steele and some of his colleagues. That's a really that's a pretty nerdy piece of work if you really want to dig into it. But that is I can't understate, that's a really, really good project that I don't think gets enough kind of press of how well done that was, and ultimately improves our understanding of this topic quite a bit. But then the other thing is just there's a field of kind of methodology called like investigating like precision medicine or individualized medicine, that a lot of the similar kind of arguments and things apply to the things that I kind of raised in our review paper, and I cite a lot of those papers in the review paper. But if you look up, precision medicine or individualized medicine and methodology and statistics and things like that, a lot of the similar stuff will come up that kind of has similar lines of reasoning to the types of designs and types of things that are necessary to investigate individual responses to medicine, to exercise, et cetera. It's very similar kind of lines of thinking when you think about an intervention and then ultimately the response to an intervention.
I think that's all great and really interesting stuff. And I don't know if you can send me anything that you've mentioned,
Yeah, absolutely.
But I can link it all kind of in the description, or at least have it available for people who are interested. As we kind of wrap up, knowing that there's still a lot of cool stuff to come where we can better understand the topic you're passionate about. What would you leave? And I'm sure people could tease this stuff out if they're really, really interested. Sure. But to kind of condense it, what would you leave our listeners with? And I'll kind of leave this open ended. It doesn't have to be practical like programming advice or coaching advice or content creation or business or academia or whatever. But just like a few words on your experience with the process, your experience coaching, whatever you think is relevant. What would you say to the listeners who are, either in a similar situation as you or kind of up and coming and trying to make their way to the same place or beyond it?
Man, that's tough. Ultimately the thing I always just seem to be fulfilled by, man, I'm not a motivational speaker. It feels like I'm not trying to say something here like the music's going to start in the background, but it's the thing that always kind of when I feel the most fulfilled is just like taking on the challenge of trying to learn more and challenge your own beliefs. I just like that concept, and that has always pushed me to hopefully develop in a positive direction of just taking my the way that I do things now. And okay, I guess this is actually a decent quote. One thing my dad told me when I was growing up that has stuck with me to this day is he talked about something he said in a meeting with some of his coworkers one time, when someone responded. He asked like, okay, so like why do we do it this way? And someone said, well, we did it that way because that's the way we've always done it. And he was like, no, you never do something the way that it's always been done. You do it because it's the best way to do it. And that is kind of been the philosophy that I've tried to navigate education through, is just always trying to challenge my positions, challenge my beliefs, and develop principles that are consistent and I can support to the best of my ability. And that has evolved in the sense that I've don't believe a lot of things that I used to now, and that probably will continue to be the case. And that's just kind of the ethos of an academic, I guess, is just trying to be less wrong than the day before, but you're always realizing you're never going to kind of reach the asymptote. You're always going to be a little bit wrong, and you're just trying to be less so. So the music can stop now, and I can feel less uncomfortable.
Well, you say that jokingly, but I really want to play like the Star Spangled Banner as you talk about that. Maybe the Rocky soundtrack. I can't decide between the two. I just envision you. It's kind of like your floating face, and there are fireworks going off, and you hear cannons booming in the background. Which I probably will do. I think that's going to be hilarious. But no, I think that's correct. I think those are really wise words. Really, I say reinvigorating. Not that I lost it, but reinvigorating in the sense of it's like a nice reminder of, hey, just doing it to do it isn't the goal. Doing it to do it better is the goal.
Right.
And I think too that mimics or mirrors a belief I have, and I've been talking about recently, which is what I've found is necessary to feel fulfilled is always having something you're striving towards.
Sure.
And I don't say striving towards as in like, wow, I'm really stoked to take this next breath, so I can get some oxygen, or, to, eat the next meal so I have some energy to function on. But having those like higher order interests by which you can have like a meaning and a purpose. Shout out to Todd Cashton. They are constantly trying to like, push towards or explore or understand, and feeling like you're more actively engaging with the world and not passively experiencing it. So
Sure.
I'm in complete agreement, and it's a great reminder of like, I started working with a guy recently, Coach Am, actually like a few days ago. His name's Derek. So shout out to Derek. I'm sure he's going to be excited to hear this, but I told him, I'm like, hey, I'm excited to coach you. You're going to challenge some beliefs I have about coaching or programming, or you're going to challenge the way I do things. And I kind of feel uncomfortable right now. But actually that's necessary
Yep.
because I should probably reconsider some of what I'm doing to make it more effective. And I think that's why that iterative process, and that's why mutual participation between the two, coach athlete, is very important. Is because it's like, hey, call me out on my bullshit. Also provide me with information and context that can allow me to refine what I'm doing, instead of it just being this passive, like, here's a thing, do the thing. I don't know what's happening, but there's going to be an outcome at the end of it. And then I'll just like rewrite my best approximation instead of like, oh, you said this didn't work. I need to stop doing this. And it's been proven over time that it's not working, or something's not working. So it should change.
Yep.
Very wise words. I really appreciate that. I'm sure, this is, I as I do podcasts, I always think of the title as we're podcasting, and I had already landed on the best training podcast ever, all caps. Zach Robinson, PhD, parentheses, C. So I'm going to break this into two parts. So if the people listening, if you made it to the end of the second part of the podcast, congratulations. You're that much, I want to say smarter, but it's not true. You probably just feel a little bit dumber, if anything, or less competent. But I think it was a great conversation. I'm super excited for people to be able to listen to it and to be able to think critically about their training and their interests and what they do. With that being said, if you guys do enjoy it, please leave a review for the podcast or rate it. I don't know what it does for the podcast, but when I look at the number of people who have rated it and given it 5 stars, I get really tingly inside, and that's good for me. It somewhat beats off the dread that I feel every day just waking up and existing. Zach, if people are interested in following along with the content you put out, which is, as I've mentioned multiple times, like really high quality, really well done. And now that you're on the tail end of everything, I'm sure going to be a little bit more present. Where can they find it? Where can they support you and Josh and Jake, Drake, and the team?
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, Josh, thanks for having me back on. It's been good to catch up and see how you're doing. And obviously another great conversation that's taken me, got me some thoughts to take away with as well. If you're interested in the stuff that we do, you can head to data-drivenstrength.com. That's where, Hub got a lot of our stuff on there. That'll take you to pretty much everything, or you can look us up on Instagram at zach.datadrivenstrength or datadrivenstrength. We have a team page as well. You can find all of our links and stuff there as well.
Awesome. Yeah. Go support those guys. They're doing really good work. I always learn so much when I read the articles they put out or the content they put out. And I haven't listened to the podcast really, so I'm excited to dig into the backlog you guys have created and learn that much more about what I thought I knew. Because I think a lot of this is just made up if you've never really encountered information that challenges it. So I'm really excited to dig into that. Again, thanks for listening to the podcast, guys. It was an excellent episode, and I'm really, really excited to bring you next week's episode, which is, with Brent Roberts, who's a personality researcher, and something I'm really excited to share. So we'll catch you all next week on another episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast.